Hello and welcome to another NCPG webinar. Today we are continuing with our Raschkowan Webinar series featuring the content Future Directions in Gaming Disorder Research. For those of you who are unfamiliar with NCPG, our purpose is to serve as the national advocate to mitigate gambling-related harm. We have a few upcoming webinars if you're interested in continuing this type of content. Expanding access to gambling treatment, telehealth, and web-based tools on March 28th, and mobilizing local community coalitions to prevent problem gambling on April 11th. Those are both available for registration on our website at ncpgambling.org/webinars. Jump back one slide, my apologies. Just a note of caution to anyone who may be triggered by this content. The slides and the presenter will reference gambling elements, gambling imagery, and gambling related terms. If you have any concerns about that, feel free to step away from the webinar and reach out for help. The National Problem Gambling Helpline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-GAMBLER. We would also like to thank our supporting partners for presenting this webinar free of charge through the Norman Raschkowan Foundation, as well as McGill University's International Center for Youth Gambling Problems and High-Risk Behaviors. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Darabensky from McGill, who will present our speaker today.
Thank you, Kate. And once again, it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to the last of this year's Raschkowan webinar series. We're hopeful that we will be able to do it again in the fall. I do want to apologize in the sense that Dr. King is not able to do this presentation live since it's 3:30 in the morning in Australia where he's located. So that's a bit of a problem. So what we've decided to do was to tape the presentation, and you will be able to access it through the web address that Kate will provide. And for those of you who would like to go on our website for the International Center for Youth Gambling Problems and High-Risk Behaviors, which is www.youthgambling.com. Next week, it will be posted on our site. It's also a bit longer than we typically do, but I think you'll find it very, very informative. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel King, who's an associate professor and clinical psychologist in the College of Education, Psychology and Social Work at Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia. His expertise is the study of digital technology-based problems with a focus on online gaming, simulated gambling, and social media. Dr. King has published more than 200 peer-reviewed articles, including the first scholarly book on gaming disorder, and he's received considerable funding from the Australian Research Council to help study maladaptive gaming behaviors. This is obviously a high impact and growing problem internationally. Dr. King has provided consultation on gaming and gambling for national and international authorities, including being on the advisory panel for the World Health Organization, and he's an associate editor for several journals, including Addiction and Journal of Behavioral Addictions. At the end of Dr. King's presentation, you will see a slide with his email address, and he has asked me to convey that he'd be more than happy to receive any emails from people and try to answer all those in a timely fashion. So without further ado, Dr. Daniel King.
Hi, everybody. My name's Daniel King. I'm from Flinders University. I'm a researcher in the area of problem gaming and gaming disorder, and I'm also a registered clinical psychologist. I'm very honoured to give a Raschkowan lecture. The area of player-game relationships in gaming disorder research. So in this talk, I'd really like to offer some critical thoughts and reflections on the state of problem gaming research in considering essentially the units of analysis in that is players and games. How do we conceptualize problem gaming, considering both the vulnerabilities of the player and aspects of games? So I'll begin with some acknowledgements and disclosures. I have no industry funding or any connections to industry at all that I need to declare. Some of the work that I've done in the last decade or so has been funded by the Australian Research Council through a fellowship. I've also received very small grants from some Australian non-profit organisations. I'm also a member of the World Health Organization expert group on gaming disorder, and to my knowledge, I have no other relevant conflicts of interest to declare. I want to begin, as this talk is very much focused on the nature of gaming, to acknowledge recreational gaming, and particularly that there are many functional and adaptive uses of games, that many people play games in ways that improve their lives. Gaming can be a productive, socially significant activity that increases psychological well-being of players. And it's for this reason, I think, that research into problem gaming and gaming disorder should recognise the ways in which gaming may be stigmatised, potentially through our choice of language and the way that we describe gaming, or the way in which we describe people who have problems related to their gaming. Another issue that I'm quite wary of, and I owe this to my longtime collaborator, Paul Del Fabro, are concern-based arguments. Any sentence you see in a journal article that begins with, "It is concerning," or "many people express concern," I think we should be very wary of these sorts of arguments, because essentially they're empty arguments, and also they lack scientific credibility because they are untestable. They're based on emotion. And I'm also wary of any potential or proposals for restrictive countermeasures to restrict gaming, treating gaming as though it were a toxic or inherently harmful activity, like a substance. So these are some important issues that I think are worth acknowledging and we should be mindful of when we talk about gaming. So gaming disorder, as we know, has been included in the International Classification of Diseases in the 11th revision. This is just a snapshot of those defining criteria. There have recently been some additional clinical features that have been added that recognise, for example, tolerance and withdrawal-like aspects. And we think, based on recent studies and meta-analyses, that about 1% of the population experience gaming problems consistent with the criteria of gaming disorder, which means that there's an even larger proportion of people out there who experience problems with their gaming that don't fall or aren't best conceptualized by these criteria. And one of the arguments I would make, and I hope it comes across in this lecture, is that I think to date we haven't been as well equipped in capturing the sorts of problems that people have with gaming that are not best conceptualized by gaming disorder. And we should be thinking of ways to conceptualize those problems. Now, I should add that there is hazardous gaming also included in the ICD-11 too, and that perhaps is another way of thinking about it. But I want to go a little bit deeper than just these symptoms and consequences. And of course, the DSM-5 text revision came out recently, and that also has retained the provisional status of gaming disorder in its research appendix, or section 3. And of particular note for this talk, that we have some references to the actual aspects of gaming, which I find interesting, particularly the competition among players across time zones, which creates people who are on different sleep-wake cycles because they're staying up quite late to play games. Reference to the random features of games like loot boxes and loot crates that contain prizes, monetary or otherwise, determined by chance. And also there's a reference to playing games 8 to 10 hours a day, which I find quite interesting because there's an explicit mention of the time invested in the activity, which we don't see, or at least there is less emphasis on in the gambling disorder clinical description. So I mentioned before, the prevalence rate of problem gaming is around 1% or 1 to 2%, and we find that this prevalence rate is actually quite varied depending on which study you look at. There's been some tests for problem gaming that provide quite high estimates of prevalence, over 10%, and I think we should be very skeptical of any reported prevalence rate that is that high, unless we're talking about a special population or a clinical population, perhaps. But my sense is that the best available evidence tells us that when we focus on the important criteria like loss of control, like functional impairment, particularly functional impairment, that prevalence rate is much closer to 1 to 2%. And so that makes gaming disorder comparable to some anxiety disorders in terms of its prevalence. It is, of course, also a hidden problem. It's one that's very hard to detect. It's hard to capture problem gamers because they may not necessarily be going to schools, for example, if we're talking about school-based surveys. They may not necessarily be going to clinical services as well. And I guess this is an issue that affects many disorders, but particularly for gaming disorder in younger populations, we see very low rates of help seeking and we see high rates of school absenteeism. So these are sorts of issues that suggest perhaps some of these rates may be inaccurate. The gaming disorder classification has had something of a controversial history. And I don't really like the word controversial, but I suppose it has triggered some debate, particularly a debate that has been between academics or within academia, as well as between academia and industry. And this is a statement that was presented by a number of professional bodies associated with the gaming disorder, releasing a statement highlighting the positive aspects of gaming, the high proportion of people who experience some benefit or value of gaming, and expressing concern. There's that concern argument to see gaming disorder still contained in the WHO's ICD-11, despite citing there some significant opposition from the medical and scientific community. Now, my sense is that there wasn't really significant opposition from the medical community or the scientific community. There was certainly some, and perhaps depending on who you surveyed, there was mixed support. But that's a whole other topic we could get into. And also this video that was released by the Entertainment Software Association on YouTube, since been moved to private, highlighting again that there is some good news because the concerns around gaming disorder are unfounded. And part of the reasoning that was offered in this video is, for example, things like there are cognitive benefits of gaming. Girls who play games are more likely to go into STEM careers and similar arguments. None of these arguments are particularly valid in challenging gaming disorder as a clinical construct. In fact, they're actually emphasizing the other end of the spectrum, but worth acknowledging as part of this, to highlight some of the arguments that have been used against gaming disorder. Here's another very recent, or very highly cited recent paper on the debate. And I should say it's not actually that recent, it's 2017, but you know, we live in COVID times. So it still feels recent to me. That argues that we expect that gaming disorder in the ICD-11 will cause significant stigma to millions of children and adolescents who play video games as part of a normal, healthy life. So this has been the other argument, that having a clinical classification for problem gaming will change the way that regular gamers or non-problem gamers are perceived. They might be mistreated or blamed, or various other arguments have been put forward. And I think this debate perhaps at times can be characterized as black and white in the focus that it's had on the problems associated with gaming and the benefits of gaming, trying to draw a line between these two activities, with certain groups feeling the need to justify perhaps that gaming has benefits or that gaming has problems, rather than seeing both together. So these are the competing perspectives. We have a desire amongst some gaming stakeholders like the industry, who are motivated to protect the image and perception of gaming as a recreational activity and artistic good, who have expressed very strong resistance to games as an addictive product. And we also have a desire among some scientists, including clinicians who work in dedicated addiction services, who want to validate, protect, and assist vulnerable users of games who develop problems, and have some resistance to the argument of gaming as entirely or always beneficial under all conditions. And it can lead to these logical axioms like, if gaming is bad for you, then gaming cannot be good for you. Or if gaming can be good for you, this might be the industry perspective, then gaming cannot be bad for you. And perhaps there's an alternative view, a compromise of sorts, that gaming can have both good and bad effects for players under certain conditions. And here we're putting some emphasis on both the players and the gaming activity itself. And that, in a nutshell, is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how people actually play games. What are they doing? What are the sorts of different types of gaming experiences? How do some people form a relationship with the game? And in what ways can we call that a harmful relationship or a problematic relationship? And it's important to acknowledge right off the bat that gaming isn't just gaming. That is to say, gaming is many different things, and gaming is a constantly technologically evolving activity, where we've seen over the last few decades, it's emerged from being something that existed in a third place, like an arcade, to having a strong presence in the home, in the console market, rise through the 90s to the online gaming in the early 2000s, to becoming very heavily strong in the area of mobile gaming, casual gaming on portable devices. And so it's a changing and ever-changing and diverse activity. And that diversity extends to its design. We find it increasingly difficult, I think, to categorize a game. How would you describe a particular game in terms of its core features? And I think increasingly we see more games like sports games and horror games, open world games, puzzle games that are a hybrid of many different basic game design and genre elements. So a soccer game now is more like a role-playing game than a soccer game used to be. And within that, that's led to, I think, a lot of monetization of those game elements. So in research, the typical genres of games that you will see that are perhaps partitioned from one another are things like the MMO, the massively multiplayer online role-playing game, which has been a focus of probably the most studies into problem gaming. If I were to guess, I haven't checked that number, but I would say that there's a lot of research on MMO games. that's focused on problem gaming. And the other main category we tend to see in studies are MOBAs, multiplayer online battle arena games, as another comparison. And these are huge, obviously, in many parts of the world and have association with esports. We also have much shorter gaming experiences that I think it's probably not strictly true to call these finite experiences, because people can replay them over and over, much like they can read a book over and over. But in general, we would say that many of these 10 to 20 hour story-driven games are less commonly associated with problem gaming, both in survey type research as well as in what is seen clinically in terms of people being referred for problems. They're not typically playing these kinds of limited or finite gaming experiences. And then, of course, there's social games, games that people are playing on their phones. Many of these games are monetized, or what they call freemium games, where you the base game is free, but you are often solicited to spend money within the game. And these are highly popular too. And of course, many games also have multi-layered reward systems, where there's usually a combination of fixed and variable ratio reinforcement within the game. And I think it's important that our research is sensitive to these different types of games. I'm not sure that genres are actually a very meaningful variable anymore, really, in the way that we designate games. And perhaps it's time for us to start thinking about what elements of games we really care about. When we do gambling research, we can ask people about roulette, or keno, or bingo, or horse racing, and I think a lot of those games or activities are far more sort of meaningful as a unit of analysis, but less so when we're talking about video games. And some of the research into smartphone use among adults is finding that we are spending increasing amounts of time on our phones, that the average time that adults in Australia are spending on their phone is about 5 hours per day, checking their phone at least every 30 minutes, but far more frequently than that on average, with 2,000 interactions per day on their phone. And people here reporting, 46% of people reporting in this study that they feel they overuse their phone, and that they are constantly, this is among people who overuse their phone, 46% feel a constant need to check their phone. So this constant need to check, and what might be motivating that? It might be things like fear of missing out, but it might also just be out of habit. And another recent study, again pre-COVID, is smartphone use among young people, young adults. They're finding that the main strategies that people are using to reduce their phone use is to either turn it off or to mute it. And the other part that's relevant to this discussion is that social media is increasingly integrated into games, or perhaps connected to games, particularly around streaming culture, where people are not only watching games, they're playing with other people who are also broadcasting their gaming. And so gaming has become a lot more social in that way too. And some other recent gaming innovations, though these are somewhat less, when we're talking about virtual reality, is a little less popular, though perhaps is projected to grow more, I think, as the technology becomes more it could be used more often if it becomes lighter, cheaper, and fully wireless, which it already is, but very few people who own consoles, for example, actually buy the virtual reality headsets to go with them. And I think where we're at now, if we're asking ourselves what are the main innovations in gaming, I think probably it's in the service area, in the way that people access games. And people, I think, are increasingly, much like they are with TV and film, immersed in large libraries of games and have access, and they're paying a subscription toward gaming. So people have access to far more content than they ever have had with gaming services, and that's likely to continue. So back to this point about time in research, my sense is that the way in which we've measured the way that people play games is both limited because people are very poor at estimating how much time they spend. People are terrible, really, at self-reporting accurately the time they would typically spend. So often when we measure gaming time, it's relative to others, because we assume that people are either overestimating or underestimating, and probably more likely underestimating. But also that there's such a diversity in gaming content that to reduce it to time is to overlook a great deal of psychological phenomena that is happening when people play games. And so while we recognize this diversity of gaming, we still measure it in hours and sometimes minutes when we study the effects. And if we're talking about problem gaming, time spent gaming is not the dose. It's not what people are actually extracting from the experience of playing a game. How much time they play is somewhat irrelevant to the dose. And I'll talk more about that later. Time spent gaming also doesn't produce reliable effects. I also don't think that time spent gaming has any or much of a relationship to people feeling satisfied with how much they play games. When we ran a sleep study about 10 years ago, we looked at differences between playing for 1 hour before bedtime and 3 hours before bedtime. And it wasn't the focus of the study, but I was interested in how much longer people wanted to play. And these are teenage boys. When we compared the two conditions, how much longer did they want to play after they played for 1 hour versus 3 hours? And I found that there was really no difference at all in how long they wanted to play for. If they played for 1 hour, they wanted to play for another 45 minutes. And if they played for 3 hours, they wanted to play for about another 45 minutes. So there's this sense that time spent is not really related to association of gaming desire, if you like. And also time spent gaming doesn't really measure problems or have a strong relationship to gaming problems. It's correlated only about 0.3 or 0.4. So it goes to show that that two people can play for the same amount of time, and one can experience problems, interference with their life and difficulties, and the other has no such difficulties. And time is associated with engagement, but time does not equal engagement. So what might be some of the reasons that people play games? Well, there's a whole range of motivations. And I've included these pictures here because I think they convey them quite nicely. I've forgotten the character's name. I think it might be Sylar. I've probably got that wrong. From The Matrix, he's contemplating the virtual piece of steak that he knows is not real, but is still satisfying. And we found that in studies too, that when we ask people about how important their avatar is to their gaming experience, they will use all kinds of sentimental language and say that this thing is really important to me and I get great satisfaction out of playing the game and my character and making it look updated and improved and so on. But then if that character were to be deleted, they would say, well, it wasn't real anyway. It doesn't really matter. So there's this interesting relationship to virtual content. We've got Boromir here from Lord of the Rings. He's contemplating the great power, the kind of wish fulfillment, the ultimate fantasy that is offered through games, or through the ring and therefore through games, and the excitement factor of discovering, having a golden ticket to do something that you wouldn't be able to do in the real world. So I think these are some of the motivations that have been explored. It affects our mood. It fulfills wishes. It gives us another place in which to exist. It's a way of exploring our identity or creating a new identity, resolving self-discrepancies, that discrepancy between the person that you are and the person that you wish to be. Games also might give people, particularly people who are more anxious, a sense of control over their life. Small work-like tasks that give them a sense of achievement, a sense of controllability and predictability. Gaming is also something that may be appealing for many people because it provides a measurable sense of progress, a sense that you're constantly building towards something, that instead of having setbacks like you might in life. In life, we often invest a lot of time and effort into things that result in nothing. Just ask any academic in talking about grant applications. And the games are also quite convenient, accessible, and when compared to other leisure activities and options, it's relatively inexpensive and doesn't require going anywhere or doing much of anything other than providing minimal input through a game controller. Now, some might take issue with minimal, but it's not a full body experience, let's put it that way. And so there are game factors that might contribute to people playing longer than they would intend, or just simply maintaining their engagement in a game activity over a long period of time. And that's issues or aspects like the never-ending aspect of games, or their complexity, the randomness, the random reinforcement of games, as well as the social features that people form bonds and relationships within games, that they have spent money in the game, that therefore they feel invested, that they have to maintain and rationalize that they would be losing money if they didn't continue to play. And the game itself might be structured in such a way that consistent play is the optimal way to make progress, and there are penalties for not playing. So these are some of the factors that I think are important when weighing up how much time a person is spending in a game and making sense of that. Why are they spending so much time? Why are they spending 40 hours a week playing a game? What's important about that experience? What motivation is it satisfying? What aspects of the game are contributing to that person's desire? And there was a large study in 2015 of 140,000 plus gamers that was able to cluster particular types of motivations together, that we tend to see people who after a challenge in a game also tend to want more power out of the game, or they want a sense of completion through the game. And some of these motivations perhaps are similar to what's been described in some of the early gaming theories, like Barthel's theory of the 4 players and so on. So we tend to see clusters of motivations that player types tend to emerge, and they may players in each of these quadrants may play for similar amounts of time, but what they're doing in the game is very different, and their problems with the game may be explained through different mechanisms, not just time. And on a basic level too, when we look at some of the complex games that require a large amount of time investment, we can see that the game design is fundamentally about encouraging the player to increase their commitment and through its progression system. So for example, in the early stages of the game, very little time is required to level up, whereas as the player makes it further through the game, the demands on the player's effort and time will increase. And perhaps in some cases, this can start to converge or look like a kind of tolerance experience, where the person simply wants to reach one level, progress through one level each time they play, but the time requirement associated with that is changing or becomes uncertain. And so they spend an increasing amount of time simply to get the same effect or outcome that they were after initially. So perhaps these sorts of systems are contributing to what looks like a tolerance experience, but isn't really tolerance. And I really like this paper by James and Tunney that came out in 2017, where they argued for the need for researchers to conduct more behavioural analysis of activities that we are conceptualising in behavioural addictions. And they offer this criticism, or discuss this criticism of gambling research, which places an emphasis on individual dysfunction as the locus of gambling problems, that in some way we're explaining problems by focusing on the individual, that they have certain perhaps personality characteristics, or they have a loss of control that overlooks some of the other explanations. But in addition to that, we're focusing particularly on the end of the spectrum, the most severe types of problems, particularly the addiction-like problems. And they call for more research into some of the drivers of persistent behavior within the activity, things that are happening within gambling, within gaming, within social media, and to understand how different reinforcement schedules, for example, are contributing to the initiation of excessive play or activity that progresses to an addiction. And I really like that point, because I think it's important that we don't just make this distinction between healthy and unhealthy, or addiction and non-addiction type of play, and consider the progression of regular activities or common normative activities into problems among certain individuals. And one question I think that's worth looking at when we talk about gaming, because it has this association with being a very skillful and strategic activity, is, do all games require skillful play in order to increase the player commitment? And we ran an analysis of, basically we went through the patents that had been filed for certain games and identified that there seems to be some games that use tactics to encourage player spending. And we coined this term, well, we didn't coin it, I suppose, but we offered a definition for it, of predatory monetization, which refers to schemes that involve in-game purchasing that are disguising or withholding the true long-term cost of the gaming activity until the player has become quite committed. And we think there are many identifiable schemes within games that encourage repeated player spending using the tactics and elements that include things like not giving the player enough information, providing false or misleading randomness statements about how things work, giving the player highly intrusive and unavoidable solicitations. That might mean things like, every time the player logs into a game, there's a pop-up, would you like to spend money? Or you've reached, you only have this many gems left, for example. Would you like to buy more? Here's a limited time offer. And also systems that manipulate the reward outcomes to reinforce purchasing behaviours over skillful and strategic play. Now, I think the field is doing a really good job. There's work by many teams that's highlighting the influence of loot box events in games, and comparing people who play games with loot boxes and without loot boxes, and people who spend money on loot boxes versus acquire them for free, and looking at those associated consequences for problem gaming. And I think that's very interesting work, and I think there's potential for it to be explored even further, perhaps looking at the different implementations of loot boxes and how that contributes to problem gaming. So that's one example, I think, of gaming research that's taking into account the structural characteristics in a really interesting way. And fundamentally, many of these systems are exploiting inequalities in information between the purchaser and the provider. So the industry, or the game developer, provider, service provider, has knowledge of what the players' game-related preferences are, how much money they've got, how they like to play, or how others who are very similar to that player like to play, and then present offers that, based on the available information, are predetermined to maximise the likelihood that that player will continue to spend money. So essentially using the player's information and the population of players' information against them, essentially, in order to get them to spend more money. And here's one example of this. It's a patent for mystery boxes that adjust in their reward likelihood based on past spending behaviour. So it's monitoring how much you have spent, or what you what's more likely, how likely you are to spend money, and then presenting an offer based on that. And I think psychologically, we can see games that have many systems that are increasing the time that you spend playing, things that require grinding or time-based goals, what we might call a cooldown. So for a game where you run out of energy, and then you have a choice of either running around and doing other things before it recharges or spending money. But these are things which will keep the player playing for longer, waiting for things to reset or recharge. And there's also systems that require spending in order to play. So the option to purchase rewards, or what they call a paywall, when you cannot make any more sort of satisfying progress unless you want to pay money, and then that obstacle that's in your way is removed. And so we think there's psychological consequences of systems like this, where people who are spending more time might be saying to themselves, well, I'm a sensible person who won't waste time in games, but I'm spending so much time in the game. So in order for me to make sense of that, resolve the dissonance, the things that I'm doing must be worthwhile. And in contrast, spending money, we have through the study of behavioral economics, we have effects like the endowment effect, where people who spend money on things are more likely to value them higher than if they hadn't spent money on them. And so some of these observations that emerge from research of this kind, looking into these different systems, we would say that people spend a lot of time in games, but they almost always have a reason, or think they have a reason. And maybe that reason comes later, more post hoc. And games are also becoming more socially integrated. They're tailored and reactive to players. They're not simply passive. They're not like books. They're not fixed. They're dynamic and changing, and they can change for individuals based on what they're doing in the game. And some of the core design principles we often think about are things like choice and giving the player agency and power, and reinforcing the correct game behavior. I came across this recently. It's just a headline on the FDA aiming to cut down on smoking by slashing the nicotine levels in cigarettes. And if we're thinking of gaming or conceptualizing gaming as an addiction, I'm not sure exactly what we would cut down, or how we would cut down problem gaming by slashing some aspect of it. And we've certainly seen in some countries that they've introduced restrictions on reward progression. For example, there was a fatigue system introduced in China that would limit how much progress you could make in a particular sort of game after a certain point, or some other kind of time restriction. The point here is that gaming doesn't seem to have the same easily identifiable psychological ingredient or chemical ingredient to it like other addictive, or like a addictive substance, as much as it's sometimes been argued. And so when we think about the dose effect in gaming, and we look to the construction of criteria like tolerance and withdrawal, we see in gambling, for example, a reference to increasing bets to gain the required or expected or desired excitement level, or consuming more potent or more drugs in order to achieve intoxication. But when we talk about gaming, and this has been the major challenge for conceptualizing tolerance, what is the dose and what is the effect? Is it time? Is it just how much time a person spends? And what do people get out of? What is the effect? What's the general effect? We might say it's excitement, but not everyone plays games for excitement. Many people play games that they find they don't want to play because they're too exciting. They want something that's relaxing. So it's not as simple. And when we look at the DSM-5 screening item that's been proposed by Petrie et al. 2014, we have, do you feel the need to play for increasing amounts of time, or to play more exciting games, or more powerful equipment to get the same excitement? So there's a construction of tolerance that is in terms that may or may not be applicable to all types of players. And we ran a study some time ago about exploring different ways of conceptualizing tolerance and looking at how many of these might be related to problem gaming. We looked at increasing time. We looked at feeling that the amount of time was inadequate, that chasing rewards, wanting to hoard virtual items, wanting novel rewards, fearing missing out, fearing that the rewards you have are diminishing in value, wanting more difficult tasks, all sorts of things. And we put these together into a survey, And we found that there were three main factors that seemed to emerge. The first was inadequacy, feeling like you need to spend more and more time in the game, and feeling like what you've done is not quite adequate. And then being motivated by a sense of achievement, wanting to do things, wanting to pass levels, beat bosses and so on. And then wealth, which was kind of like the acquisition of virtual content, like currency or rare items and so on. And that analysis found that inadequacy emerged as the strongest factor. And this idea that the perception of earned game rewards was inadequate was most associated with problem gaming. And perhaps for some people who are experiencing problems with games, they have a decreasing reward sensitivity to what the game is offering them. That the rewards start to lose their psychological value, and they continue to play without any kind of satisfaction. And so we put forward this alternative to tolerance, which is the need to complete increasingly more intricate, time-consuming or difficult goals in order to feel the desired state of immersion. And we put forward state of immersion because we thought that might be a more encompassing term, because you could feel excitement within that state. But the emphasis here really is on what the player is seeking from the game, which is not just more time, it's actual specific playing requirements, things that they would want to do. And it's for this sort of reason that it's very difficult to run laboratory studies of gaming. In contrast, when you run gambling studies, you can give people money and that will simulate very well a gambling experience for them, because they're chasing the profit. Whereas in games, it's very hard to provide a game experience that has that ecological validity. We ran a review a few years ago wanting to understand what was found in terms of the units of games, sort of the structural characteristics or the genre, and the player vulnerabilities. So things like impulsivity, taking risks, psychological distress, and motivations. What was known on this topic? What does the literature say about the nature of problem gaming and player-game relationships? And we found that MMORPG gameplay tended to have the strongest positive association with problem gaming, and that problem MMO players tended to have a more socially anxious profile, and they were more attracted to work-like roles in the game for that reason of it providing a sense of safety and security and predictability that they were often not experiencing in their real-world life. And problem players of shooters tended to have a profile of scoring higher on sensation seeking and impulsivity than other players. So this sense that certain types of games might attract, or at least produce, or perhaps just be associated with certain types of problem gamers. And the studies that have been done on problem gaming tended to fall into certain categories as well. And my impression of these is that much of the work that's been done is quite exploratory, that we haven't really been able to develop a very cohesive, universal model of problem gaming that accounts for the diversity of gaming characteristics. And this is just one example highlighting different motivational profiles that are associated with problems. And you tend to see this kind of what is sometimes called this Moore effect, where the problem gamers just tend to score higher on everything compared to non-problem gamers. And we see that in gambling research too, that if we ask about motivations like intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, and just a motivation, the lack of motivation, that problem gamers tend to score higher on everything. And so you're not often sure if that is really an important factor or not. And there was a more recent review of problem gaming and structural characteristics of games, which recommended that we need more theory-based taxonomies of structural game characteristics. And I published a taxonomy of gaming in 2010. This was something emerged out of the work I was doing in my PhD, where I felt back then that just simple units of analysis like the rewards versus the presentation features and so on. And I want to say here that taxonomy is very basic and very preliminary, and I don't consider it to be an authoritative taxonomy by any means, and certainly requires a lot of improvement. And the other point I want to make about that taxonomy, as I often see it misquoted in papers, is that it's not actually a taxonomy of problem gaming. It's a taxonomy of gaming that highlights features that might be related to excessive gaming, not specifically gaming addiction. And that was not the point of the paper at all. It might have some relevance to explaining some problem gaming behaviours in gaming addiction, but it's not by itself a gaming addiction taxonomy. I also wanted to draw attention to this study. It's a 2021 study by Andrew Shabilsky's team, which I think deserves a lot of commendation for using an approach that has rarely been done before, and certainly hasn't been done properly in problem gaming research. And actually, my point is that it hasn't been done properly in any, there's been no actual problem gaming studies that have used this approach, including this one. But the approach is really interesting because it involves using the objective telemetry data from players, the sort of data that you might see that the industry has access to, that it can download from individual players, that's often used in, has been used for a long time in the field of gambling. And this is a study that wants to look at time spent playing and well-being. So the games of interest to this study were a couple of Nintendo games, Plants vs. Zombies and Animal Crossing, which are perhaps more family-friendly, casual type games. And there was a collaboration with the game providers or developers, where from a pool of many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of players, they were able to have around a few hundred, or they had 518 in one sample, who completed some survey instruments. So it's a study that takes it's got a very accurate insight into gaming behaviour. However, the population to hand is only a very small proportion, and they tend to skew a bit older. But the study was very well equipped to look at the differences between objective and subjective data, highlighting that essentially people are not the best at estimating how much time they spend. And as a side note, we have tried to do this on a smaller scale, but without any industry collaboration, with Destiny 2 players, and we found similar results with the actual versus reported player data, that people were just very poor. There was very poor correlations between what people say they do and what they actually do. And this study, unfortunately, didn't include a measure of problem gaming, but did include measures of well-being to examine that relationship. And I wanted to draw attention to this conclusion, which is in the discussion section, that says, although our data do not allow causal claims, they speak to the broader conversation surrounding the idea of video game addiction. It's a beautiful sentence. I love the idea of speaking to broad conversations. And it says the discussion about video games has focused on fears. So again, these concerns about a large part of players becoming addicted. Given their widespread popularity, many policymakers are concerned about negative effects of playtime on well-being. Our results challenge that view. The relation between playtime and well-being was positive in 2 large samples. Therefore, our study speaks against an immediate need to regulate video games as a preventive measure to limit video game addiction. If anything, our results suggest that play can be an activity that relates positively to people's mental health, and regulating games could withhold those benefits from players. Now, I have full respect for the authors for conducting this study, and I think it was very well needed, and I won't respond to every aspect of that paragraph. But I did want to raise, as the devil's advocate, perhaps, what would the results of a population study of eating look like that followed a similar design. You might find if you took very accurate eating data from people who went into restaurants, for example, or really any kind of eating and experience, even could be in a person's home, and you had a sample of 500 people who eat food, and 0.2% of those people responded, and you had them say that there was a small correlation between the time or the amount of food that they ate and their well-being, what kind of conclusions would we make about a study of that kind? Would the benefits of eating food or some foods challenge concern about unhealthy eating and eating disorders, perhaps, if we wanted to draw a connection to that? The fact that we have 500 people who are not representative of the entire community, of the gaming community, expressing benefits of a small magnitude, I think is not an argument or does not challenge the view of that another small proportion of people experience problems. And would a study of eating highlighting benefits of eating challenge the guidelines, restrictions, and regulation of eating? And I guess we're using broad terms there to even include things like the way in which parents should regulate their children's eating. And my sense is that we're coming back to this black and white issue where we're using highlighting the benefits of an activity to argue against the downsides. But is there an alternative to time? Let's come back to this gaming time variable. So my sense is that there might be. Gaming is an interactive activity that has cognitive and attentional demands, requires hand-eye coordination in certain games, and there's skill and strategy involved. There's an emphasis on the player's goals and intentions, things that they're trying to do. If you ask someone who plays games what they're playing at the moment, the first thing they're probably going to say is how the game that they're playing, how long they've played it, perhaps, or where they're up to in the game, or they're stuck on something. That's what they're trying to do. I'm nearly up to the last boss. I'm just trying to get through to the end. I'm trying to finish it. They don't say, I'm playing a certain game and I've spent 250 hours. Well, maybe they do. They maybe say that too. But my point is that I think they focus on the rewards and the activity itself. And it's not simply passively received or consumed. But how active is gaming? This is a question I'd like to put forward. Now, being conscious of time, I might skip through some of these models of gaming behaviour, but my point in highlighting these models is to emphasise that reward in games is central to understanding problem gaming and gaming addiction. And just to recap, perhaps at this point, some of the points that I've made. So gaming is a very diverse class of activities. It includes different units of genre and structural features, online connectivity and reinforcement. There's this assumption that gaming is very much a goal-based activity that's fundamentally about seeking rewards. Research is often found or focused on time and the extreme end of the problem gaming spectrum. You look in any survey-based study of problem gaming and you'll find and I've done this too, there's the normal or non-problem group, and then the group that is the problem group, or perhaps more correctly now, we should say the group experiencing problems. Though I prefer problem group because it fits in a table, but I don't mean to make any kind of, make it a problem-based approach and contribute to stigma. It's simply out of the necessity of saving space. That's a tangent. And then despite theoretical sophistication in research rationales, I think there's been a tendency for research to consider all gaming behaviour, all problem gaming behaviour through the lens of the gaming disorder symptomatology. So as a form of pathology and risk and harm. And I think that's unfortunate because I don't think the gaming disorder criteria are the best way to conceptualise all problem gaming. And I think many clinicians would agree that even clients who meet the criteria for problem gaming, or for gaming disorder, would have a preferred conceptualization, and it's ideal to work within that. So I want to talk about the dual process model because I think it's relevant to understanding a whole range of gaming activities that we're not currently capturing in our research. And in the dual process model, we, at a basic level, recognize two systems. The first system, which is based on habit, and the second system, which is based on goals. And system one is about, it works quickly, it's fast, it's responsive, it's also effortless, and habits are often used interchangeably with the term automatic behavior or automaticity, that we think about things that people do without thinking. And I think a lot of gaming involves this system. Then we have system two, which is a far slower model, slower form of cognition. It's more effortful, it's decision-based. It requires cognitive resources, more attention in order for the person to engage in the gaming activity. So making constant new choices, for example. And with habits, these are associations that are learned through experience, and they're conceptualized as a kind of stimulus response association. And goals are motivating when forming habits. It's important to have a goal if we want to establish a habit, but habits are mentally linked to situations and rely on these context response associations to activate behaviors, things that we are used to doing in a certain place or a certain time. And often our habits can conflict with our goals and intentions, and this is sometimes called the habit slip, where we aimed to only do one particular thing, or but instead we did the old thing, the old behavior, the thing that was established through through patterned behavior over a long period of time. And I think we can conceptualize correctly that many games involve skill and skilled actions, and the repetition of behaviors that form context response associations that form habits. And we understand that habits develop most readily when the rewards are provided on an interval schedule, which games are, I think, not uniquely equipped to do, but certainly optimized in such a way that the rewards are presented usually on more than one interval schedule at a time. But what about skill? Well, skill is not about having a really highly developed system two, where you can constantly form new goals and analyze the situation, but rather it's about speed, speed through practiced action. So this idea that the most skilled gaming players are perhaps those who have spent the most time playing the game, who've developed the most optimal behavioral patterns through practice. So skill is it has a combination of these trained elements, as well as the flexibility to apply different behaviors in different ways to achieve an outcome. And we're starting to see this come into the gambling literature. There's this nice model by Murat Yusel's team that highlights how there are certain machine design features in electronic gambling machines, for example, that interact with certain player vulnerabilities. And it might be for some people that habits form more quickly, or problematic habits form more quickly among certain people who are perhaps more impulsive, who have a history of depression and anxiety, who are more prone to cognitive biases. But I think there's also many habit-forming elements in video games. We see that even in the most complex video games, the most expensive AAA sorts of games, which tend to have a lot more content, that they are designed with certain gaming experiences in mind. And there's a famous, within gaming studies, interview with the Halo designer, who said that much of Halo is a series of 30-second loops of behavior or activity, that the player is often in a certain type of short engagement over and over and over. And the game is really built around these 30-second or approximately 30-second intervals of fun, and that these are become highly trained and repeatable. And you see the same sorts of things in certain types of games, like puzzle games and at fighting games, perhaps, where these are very short interval experiences where you're doing things that require practicing over and over, almost like the first 4 bars of a song, these same actions over and over, so they become quite habit forming. Another aspect of games which I think are habit forming are the updating of objectives and content, things which are essentially providing it's the same activity, but you are getting a new thing to work towards over and over. And an example of this is the level badges that you see in online shooters, where you have something that is essentially you're doing the same thing. You're still having to defeat opponents and pass levels and so on in order to acquire these badges, but they are just enough there to maintain motivational relevance. So the inclusion of this sort of feature might lead to more habits being formed in the game than those games which don't have these sorts of long-term updates and content. Another interesting one is the adjustable or dynamic in-game difficulty. And we see this in certain games where the idea of the game is essentially to ensure that the player can always achieve a winning scenario. So an example of this might be in Mario, where people who are in the one of the sort of the lower positions in the race, they might be coming last or close to last, are often given the best rewards in order to catch up. Whereas those who are in front are given basically worthless rewards, which won't, functionally worthless rewards that won't, that will ensure that they don't advance further beyond the pack. So it's this kind of rubber banding technique that we think might also contribute to habit forming, because it ensures that the person is always engaged with the game. And there's some interesting studies that have been done, many of them outside of psychology and more in the actual gaming area itself, because they're connected, or they are the precursor to writing patents and so on, where game developers are very attuned to what players are doing and how difficulty affects their progression. And you can see on this table, or this figure down the bottom, this graph, that the red line represents the number of players who are engaged in a particular game, and then the blue line represents the difficulty of particular aspects of the game. And you can see that as the difficulty begins to spike and becomes higher, fewer players stay within the game. So it seems to suggest that to form a habit within the game, you need a difficulty level that's attuned to the player, so that it's not too hard, but also not too easy. And that's why sort of Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow often sort of is cited by these papers, that the developers are sort of talking about how you can't be too frustrating, it can't be too boring. But the other element to it is perhaps that it's very difficult to form a habit if you're losing. Another element of games, which I think is important to understand in the formation of habit, is the rewards, particularly those that refer to, that include the negative consequences in gaming, so the being punished for not playing the game. And we see that in games like Farmville and Animal Crossing, and really just any game where if you spend some time away from the game, your resources will be affected. It might be that your crops die, or it might be that you lose access to certain rewards, or even one game I saw where your pet dog will run away if you're not playing the game. And I think these are important to habit because they ensure that the person is regular in the way that they play the game. And lastly, I wanted to draw attention to avatars. I think avatars have been the focus of a lot of problem gaming studies recently, including some really interesting neurobiological work. And a lot of that work focuses on how avatars become a way of compensating for self-discrepancy, or the expression of the person that you are in the real world, or that you want to be in the real world and would be if you could. But I think also the avatar might also be an important representation of what's called the habit identity, where people who give up, for example, eating a lot or drinking, find that they have to wrestle not only with their cravings and urges to be a drinker, or to drink or to eat, but they also feel that they lose a sense of themselves because they were the person that was, you know, that kind of person. They were the guy, the big eater or the big drinker. And so in some ways, I think the game character is also a kind of representation of the habit identity, that the person can see on the screen who they want to be when they play the game. That might be the big powerful knight, or you know, that or whatever sort of character. It doesn't really matter, but it's I think it might be interesting to evaluate the extent to which the avatar represents the and is related to certain habitual behaviours, people doing certain things because of the avatar. And one of those things might be I always have to make sure that my avatar has certain items, or has finished what it needed to do, or has certain clothes in order to feel satisfied in the game. So within the dual process model, we say that the path to addiction involves not a pathological motivation for drugs, but though it will include that too usually, but also a shift from goal-directed to habitual consumption. And this is something that I don't think has been looked at very closely in gaming, the way in which over time people's gaming becomes less goal-directed and more habitual, where the rewards are less important to the player. They're playing more out of habit. And so we might say that the initial use is more voluntary. It involves executive functioning, making goals, setting plans into motion. And it also reflects the hedonic value and pleasure of the drug, the kind of discovery moment, the excitement of playing the game. But then habit formation impairs goal-oriented control. And in the drug literature, we would say drugs promote habit responding through the neurobiological processes that sensitize users to the incentive properties of drugs and lessen their capacity to evaluate the outcomes of actions. They don't see the long-term consequences of the behavior. And the literature says that in order to change habits, and we don't necessarily know this for gaming, but to change habits, changing intentions only affects the behaviours that are engaged in sporadically, not habitual behaviours. So we can only set a plan to change that's effective. It's more effective if it's something that we don't do very often. And the difficulty in changing habits doesn't reflect the desire or the willpower of the individual wanting to make that change, because they have habit memories that are triggered by their prior routines and context cues. And so I think back on a lot of Kimberly Young's papers when she was writing about, this would have been in the late 90s, talking about how families can help teens who are spending too much time playing games and it's interfering with their life. And a lot of her very behavioural strategies, perhaps, I've heard criticism of them for being too simple, for not addressing larger issues around beliefs and so on, but you would see within CBT, but very useful perhaps from a habit perspective in identifying that it actually doesn't matter if the person wants to change, and many of them actually don't when we're talking about teenagers. What needs to happen is the changing the habit needs to really change the routine and be able to support a new routine. And I think that's where Kimberly Young had, I think, some really useful practical ideas that were effective. And so a habit breaking intervention would involve impeding the automatic cueing of the unwanted habit. So that some of the things that have often been suggested are things like removing access to the gaming activity, taking away the shortcuts, taking away things that trigger that stimulus response association, and also promoting the repetition of a new desired behaviour. Now we're talking about a habitual behaviour. We're not talking about gaming disorder. This is not a gaming disorder intervention. But if we're talking about the full spectrum of gaming and problem gaming, then thinking about the ways in which a person's playing is a habit and which aspects of their gaming are goal-driven, I think is useful for constructing a intervention. And briefly, and I know I've gone a little bit over time here, I just want to think about, come back to different perspectives on interventions. Where we're talking here about the industry statement. So the industry is saying that it cares and very deeply about the health and well-being of gamers. and that they should see health professionals. I'll quote this for the rest of my career, and this is from Blizzard Entertainment, saying it's ultimately up to the individual player to determine how long he or she should spend playing any game. And I think we can do better than this. I think it's possible, particularly for the industry who have the tools and who have the player data to help implement ways for people to keep track of the things that they're doing. I think a lot of games offer some information to the player. They're transparent in certain games for how long you've spent playing. It might be helpful for some people to know sort of what sorts of things they're doing that appear to be fairly habitual, like the number of days that they've played in a row, the certain activities that they've done. But also, I think more broadly, just recognising from a public health perspective, it shouldn't only be on the player, it should be on a whole range of stakeholders, and those stakeholders should also be supported as well too, and work collaboratively to address problems for those people who have problems. And when we've asked nearly 1,000 gamers, some of whom were problem gamers, what they thought the industry should do, they were supportive of proactive support and funding for public health and psychology prevention schemes. Players in this study from 2021 were in support of sharing player data, so industry data, for the purpose of independent health-focused research. I think Shabilsky's study, as I said before, is a really, really positive step for the field. But the next step is to perhaps gain more representative samples, to have better measures, and also to look into the games where we know there are problem players, not the casual family-friendly games. Let's look at players in League of Legends or World of Warcraft. Let's try to identify those who appear to have problems, and it would make more sense, rather than asking people in a large sample to self-report into that study, to instead identify those who appear to be the most frequent players, those whose patterns of gaming behavior are things like 80 hours per week, to try to capture that particular group and ask them questions, and perhaps provide some incentives for those people to participate in studies. So we're not just focused on the other end of the spectrum and drawing policy conclusions based on those people. I think there's real potential for industry and academia collaboration, and I just haven't seen it happen yet. Other participants supported in-game features that facilitate greater self-monitoring and awareness, because that's the part of habits that when a person has a habit, they're not necessarily monitoring their behavior, and they're not as aware of their behavior because so much of what they're doing is automatic. And education playing time notifications in the setting. Okay. Well, I've gone over time. I think also too, there's potential for parents to have greater control over their gaming as well, not just for content ratings, but also for certain patterns of behavior. But I'll skip through this because I'm conscious of my time and I don't want to overstay my welcome, which I probably already have, and I'll get to my final messages. This is just an idea for how to promote critical thinking about games. So my take-home messages are research, and I don't just mean psychology, but everyone interested in problem gaming should consider other ways to conceptualize gaming behavior along the spectrum, not just from the addiction perspective, including individuals in the early stages of developing problems or unwanted habits. I think we should also focus on the mechanisms that lead to problems that are not simply based on addiction, and which might account for some of the non-addiction types of problem gaming, because there are problem gamers who aren't meeting those criteria for gaming disorder. They're not addicted. And I think taking this more novel, new direction might help to identify some of the countermeasures that promote healthy goals and habits in games, because there can be a healthy habit too, as well. This might lead into some exciting new research directions that are positive for the field. So apologies for going a little long. I thank you very much for your attention if you've made it this far. I have work that can be found on ResearchGate, and I've got a book on internet gaming disorder. I'm sorry that it costs so much. Hopefully you can find it through your institution. I didn't set the price. And I also wanted to just say that I'm really looking forward to going to ICBA this year in South Korea. I haven't left Australia for a long time. I've done too many talks sitting in front of a laptop like this, and I find them incredibly unfulfilling compared to seeing people face to face, no offense. But I'm really looking forward to seeing people in ICBA, but also happy to meet you through virtual means if that is our only way of meeting. So if you want to contact me, please send me an email. And thanks again for this opportunity to present. Thank you. Bye.